All right. Hello and welcome to another Friday Expert live stream. I am your host, Dan Johnson, Chief Consultant here at Next Level Nonprofits. We have an incredible guest coming up for you in just a moment. But first, a quick bit of instructions. If you're new to StreamYard, click the link in the description and add yourself to StreamYard so that we can see your name pop up during the show. As well, if you know of anybody who wants to know about the fundamentals of creating their new nonprofit and rocking, uh, invite them to the Launchpad group here, the Nonprofit Launchpad on Facebook. If you have a question for Mr. Goulding at any time during the show, just go ahead and pop it in the comments. I will see it appear, and we will pull that question on screen. So without any further ado, I'm going to welcome a nonprofit attorney of over 40 years to the Friday Expert live stream, Mr. Mike Goulding. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's fantastic to have you. And as you know, a lot of new nonprofits struggle with understanding their legal obligations, particularly because a lot of new nonprofit leaders, they didn't have a 2, 3, 4, 5 year plan to lay out their nonprofit. They just decided, hey, we're going to start this. We're going to help people, and we'll figure out the rest along the way. So first of all, as I do with every guest who comes on the Friday Expert live stream, talk to me about why you decided to get into this crazy world of nonprofits instead of just be a corporate attorney and make millions of dollars and live in a penthouse in downtown somewhere.
Well, I actually started out in that type of a job that you're describing. I am an attorney. Most of my career, I worked for a very large international law firm headquartered in San Francisco, and I was the director of the employee benefits and exempt organizations department in that firm. On the exempt organizations side, I worked mostly with very large nonprofits. A couple of them were the American Red Cross and the American Lung Association. And I did a lot of defending of fiduciaries in federal court when their actions were called into question. And so I learned a lot about how to avoid problems, legal problems, as a nonprofit. So that's kind of the genesis. And then I've kind of worked in a way kind of backwards because I went from there to a kind of a medium-sized nonprofit as their corporate counsel. And I did everything for them, from a incorporation and tax exemption and contracts. And I even got involved in grants and other fundraising, although I wasn't doing them myself. I was supervising the person who had that responsibility. And then I went from there and became the founder of a startup nonprofit, my own nonprofit, and I did everything there. So I've literally been.
Let's dig into that because a lot of people who are watching this broadcast are startup founders themselves. And so, what made you decide to take that leap and start a nonprofit yourself?
Well, my wife was a pain sufferer, and so basically, we created a nonprofit with a mission to improve quality of life for people who have chronic pain, and it was basically a labor of love, if you will. And after we recognized that there was a great need for education and understanding, both by clinicians as well as the public, about people in that circumstance. So that was kind of the idea behind it. And I kind of wanted to see the other side as a founder, as opposed to just doing legal work for nonprofits.
Yeah. And what would you say before we get into the legal stuff, what were some of the big lessons you learned starting that nonprofit?
That it's a really big job and you really need to have people who are just about as passionate as you are about the mission and can see the vision of what you want to become, as well as the same values and strategy and those types of things. And those are things that are built over time, but you
Mm.
really need to have at least an idea of that as you go into the nonprofit. So that's one of them. And then I guess the other one is that um, I really wanted to do something that was going to improve the world, and that's a great way to start with an idea, if you will, to do a nonprofit. I mean, that's obviously something that's important and required, but it just feels good to
Mm.
do that type of thing. And as an attorney working with nonprofits, that's one of the reasons why I want to do it, is because I really enjoy working with people who have a passion, and I get to help them improve the world. And that's a great thing from my perspective.
That is awesome. That is awesome. I'm gonna have to mark 654 as my marketing team's gonna create your quote meme out of that. That was a good quote. Uh, so let's get into, most nonprofit leaders do not start out thinking about all the legal paperwork that they're going to need to do to protect their organization. And frankly, they don't spend a lot of time on it. And sometimes that comes to bite nonprofit organizations. They get sued by someone because they didn't have the correct insurance or the correct policies in place. There's probably a lot of other pitfalls. And so what I promised our audience was 10 things that you should and can do to legally protect your nonprofit. So, Mr. Goulding, where should we start?
Well, I guess from my standpoint, from a legal standpoint, my experience is that nonprofits struggle with just about everything. um, mostly
There's another
because,
quote.
well, mostly because they don't know what it is that they don't know, and it's kind of a perfect storm in a way of elements that go into that. One is that you have a very complex set of laws, on a federal, state, oftentimes local level, that all uh, apply to nonprofits. And so you've got that. You've got most founders who have little or no business experience running a business, let alone a nonprofit business. And then third, a lot of times you have people out there who have started a nonprofit who really think that it's simple and easy. And I'm here to tell you that it's not. Um, in fact, if you look at the laws that apply to nonprofits, to tax exempt nonprofits, um, the rules are exactly the same, whether you're a founder with a brand new startup or you are the American Red Cross. The same rules apply. And from a legal standpoint, the large nonprofits have teams of attorneys on staff who work with them on all kinds of legal questions and legal issues. And there's a reason for that, because it's they understand and recognize and deal with the dangers that are out there. So from that, I guess my number one, I guess, strategy is really it protects the nonprofit, but as most of these things do, it also protects the individuals, and that's a really important aspect of this. When you talk about protecting a nonprofit, you're really most of the time talking about protecting the people who are in authority in that nonprofit. So the first one is, you're a fiduciary and you need to act like one. Most, I'm sure, have heard of the term fiduciary. Just so we're all on the same page here, a fiduciary is someone who has a legal obligation to protect the interests of others who aren't in a position to do it for themselves. An example of that might be for example, if you and your spouse have minor children and you go in and do a will, oftentimes, most of the time, you'll name a guardian for that child or children in your will. If something happened and that provision needed to be implemented, that person would be a fiduciary because they have an obligation to take care of the interests of a minor who is not able to take care of themselves. So that's a fiduciary. And executive officers and board members of a nonprofit are fiduciaries. So whose interests are they protecting? Number one is their charitable class. For example, if you're a nonprofit that has a mission of providing medical care to wounded veterans, the protected class there, the charitable class, are wounded veterans. So they have an interest, but they're not in a position to take care of themselves oftentimes to protect themselves. The other group is the general public. And why are you fiduciary with respect to the general public? Well, there's a huge tax benefit in being a tax-exempt nonprofit. And what that means is that all of us as members of the general public pay more, at least theoretically, pay more in taxes because of that. And so we all have an interest in making sure that a nonprofit is, created and operated in accordance with the law. And we're not in a position ourselves to make sure that happens. So basically the board becomes the public's eyes and ears to make sure that the nonprofit is operated correctly. So how do you act like a fiduciary? Well, there's lots of rules, and I'll just mention one.
That's what we love to hear.
Yeah. Well, the one that I think is probably most important is a concept called procedural prudence. And what that basically means is, the decisions that you make, you're going to be judged not so much on the actual decision, but how you reach that decision, the procedure that you use to make that decision. And a really important aspect of proving that is the minutes that you create for meetings that you hold. It's an incredible opportunity to set forth exactly how that decision is made, and recognizing that, generally speaking, if it's not included in the minutes, it didn't happen. So I've actually, in my litigation experience, had situations where the minutes that were kept were the deciding factor as to whether a fiduciary was held liable for their actions, whether good or bad.
Let's dig into that a little bit. So, what goes into a proper and good set of minutes? Because I've been in numerous nonprofit board meetings, and if they take minutes at all, it's I wrote this down on a piece of paper, and it's signed by the secretary. But the secretary could literally write anything and then sign it. So what goes into having proper sets of minutes so that when you're having your board meetings, you're making these important financial decisions and you're making these important legal decisions, they're written down in a way that if somebody wanted to challenge it later, a board member would say, I didn't say that, whatever, then the minutes kind of cover them.
Well, it's really a matter of documenting the process. Oftentimes on a particular matter, it will say, the chairman, presented this issue, and then there was a discussion, going back and forth, pros and cons. If the expertise to make that decision is not included within the board, There may be a need for an expert to help the board to make that decision. The expert doesn't make the decision, but they present evidence or instruction as to how that decision can and should be made. And then also to make sure that just the process of how the matter was presented to the board, whether a motion was made or seconded, what the vote was with respect to that matter, just going along those lines. I often talk to clients about the fact that they can make it pretty self-serving. I mean, just recognizing, thinking in advance of how somebody could challenge this particular decision, and then write it in a way so that it's obvious that the decision that was made was the prudent decision.
So it's basically just making sure to write down the decisions and who made them. And then does the secretary sign the minutes at the end, and that's all you need, or do you want the board members to sign the minutes at the end?
Typically, the secretary and perhaps the chair of the meeting would sign the minutes.
Okay, gotcha.
And the minutes should be distributed and then approved at the following meeting.
That way everybody does get a chance to say, this is what I said, or this isn't what I said. And that's recorded too.
Exactly.
Okay. Diving even deeper to like a really basic question. So for the leaders who've not had boards before, I have 2 children. The board of my family is me and my wife. We don't really have board members. If you've not really had a board before, what are the decisions that are required by law to be made by board members by a vote of the board? And what are the things that you recommend that the board vote on? I'll tell you, I generally take the position of less bureaucracy is more impact. Not always, but in most cases, you have to run it through a board of less interested individuals in what's going on all the time. If you're like, I want to buy a pen, and then you have to have a board meeting to convene to buy the pen's not going to get bought. But what are they legally required to vote on? Is it budgets? Is it, tax filings, contracts? And then what do you recommend that the board actually approve?
From a requirement standpoint, they are obligated to create policies for the corporation. So corporate policies to establish committees, if there are going to be committees for program or finance or whatever the need is. And I'm a big supporter, if there are enough board members, to having committees, because what committees typically do is to offline do the background work, for example, on a particular program. So they do the grunt work, if you will, and then bring the ultimate decision to the board as to what they've decided is the proper approach. And that way the board's time is reserved for more important, more high level work. And that's a good way to approach that type of thing. Contracts typically are not required to be approved by the board, at least in advance. If it's a significant contract, then the president typically will have the authority to sign a contract, to negotiate, and so forth. If it's a really important contract, then I might want the board to ratify the contract. If not, approve it in advance. It's really just a matter of deciding, what are the really important decisions that the board needs to make, or that the company needs to make, I should say, and to get the board involved in those types of things. If you have a a chair of the board and a separate president or executive director, for example, they should collaborate before board meetings on what things should be included in the agenda and what things don't need to be. And it's a matter of deciding, again, the significance of those things.
So I want to cut to a question from one of our members, Cebus Mission. This is one of our more active members in the group and active promoters of the group. This is a small church out of Maryland, I believe, and she asks, "What is one thing that you wish you would see more often in the bylaws of nonprofit organizations? And what is one thing that you would be like, man, I wish they didn't have that in there. It would cut down on so many problems."
Well, bylaws is one of the things that I was going to talk about.
Okay.
Bylaws are the constitution of the organization. And if you look at state law, every state except Delaware has a very comprehensive nonprofit corporation statute. And most of the provisions in those statutes are about bylaws, requirements that are there, as well as opportunities, things that will make your life easier if you include them in the bylaws. If you don't, then they typically won't apply. So I always like to make sure that the bylaws are optimized for the law of the state in which the organization is incorporated. So it's, for example, if you are in a state where you can have a decision made by just in writing, not having a meeting, and you can do it on a majority basis and not just on a unanimous basis, you may want to take advantage of that. And maybe not. I mean, it's a decision that the board can make, but at least present it to them so that they know what the options are and they can make a reasoned decision about it.
That makes sense. Back to you. I've interrupted enough, but go ahead.
Okay. That's fine. What I was going to say is that, consequences of failing to meet your fiduciary obligations is not liability for the nonprofit. It's liability for the individuals, for the fiduciaries themselves, and their personal assets are on the line. So it's important to make sure that those fiduciary obligations are met. Oftentimes, there's a reputation damage as well. If you're brought into court for breach of duty or whatever, that's something that a lot of people don't think about in advance, but that's a very real issue that can take place.
Something I learned,
So
for example, and you can tell me if this is right or wrong, but something that I was involved with a nonprofit, and very young. I was 21, and a very kind and generous soul gave me $2 million to run a nonprofit with. And I was like, I want nothing to do with the management of this money. I did not want to act as a fiduciary. I just wanted to do the work of the nonprofit. And that was a mistake because the person that I brought in to manage the money was not qualified to do so, and potentially not ethical enough to do so. And so we ended up being very behind on payroll taxes. And one of the things that I found as a new nonprofit leader at 23 was that we had not paid like a year and a half of payroll taxes for this organization. And that tax law was basically, yeah, we'll try to get it from the organization first. But if we can't, anybody who was able to sign the checks or anybody who was an officer who had fiduciary responsibility, that's now coming out of your pocket.
Yep. Well, and that brings up a very important point, and that is co-fiduciary responsibility. So not just for taxes, but as a fiduciary, if somebody else makes a mistake, you may very, very well be brought into that if you're in a position to make sure that mistake was not made. So that's another aspect of fiduciary responsibility.
Gotcha.
Okay. So anyway, that's number one. Number two, organize and run the corporation as a real business. And when I say real, I mean, have the organization um, organized and run and maintained in the way that a real for-profit business would be run. Um, Nonprofits are often run with a certain amount of informality, and that's understandable because oftentimes, it's family and friends and so forth that are involved, and so meetings may not be under Rogers rules of order, for example. Um, but it's important to know and to understand when formality is important. And there's four things that I guess I'd like to mention in this area. One is I think it's important to have at least some semblance of a business plan so that going in as well as over time to develop your mission, your vision, your values, and your strategy for how you're going to meet that mission, and to get others involved, not just yourself, because you're not going to be able to do it all yourself. Second is startup funding. I know that that's a big issue for a lot of nonprofits, and it's the number one reason why nonprofits fail is because they don't have the funding necessary, just even to start up, to incorporate, and to get the advice that they need to be able to be successful. And I advise people, if they don't have the funding to be able to do that initially, then look for other nonprofits that you can join up with that are doing the same or similar things that you want to do. And by doing that, you save yourself a lot of expense and hassle and sleepless nights. And oftentimes that's something that is available to people. Third is the bylaws, which I already mentioned. The other thing I should say is that once you have the bylaws, don't stick them in a file and forget about them, because they need to be a living document that you follow. Because if you're ever sued for something that's included in the bylaws, you're going to be judged by those bylaws because you've adopted them. So you need to make sure that you're using them as as the constitution of your organization. And then fourth is
Good question on the startup funding.
yeah.
Obviously, I know it depends, and it depends on the program that you're trying to run, and it depends on all various things. But and I know trying to get an answer other than depends out of a lawyer. Um, but
Good luck.
what what would you recommend? I've recommended 2 grand before to people that if they don't have 2 grand in the bank account, they probably should go and talk to donors about, could you give me this 2 grand in order to start this up? But what do you recommend as a general baseline where a founder can go? Obviously, there are specifics to my situation, but in general, I should have X in startup funding before I go and launch a nonprofit at the very least.
I think 2 grand is probably a good start in most cases, because that will get you incorporated. It'll get you tax exempt. It will get you some advice if you need it from experts. I mean, I guess what I say to people is get as much as you can, because there are always things that come up that you're not expecting, issues that come up and questions and so forth. And, you need the money to be able to take advantage of those things.
Makes sense. Carry on.
Okay. All right. So I was talking about directors. You need to have a nucleus of people right from the very beginning who are enough interested in your organization and its mission that they're willing to be what I call helpful skeptics. And in board meetings, they're not potted plants. Okay, so essentially they need to be involved, and they're, they're,
I love that description of the potted plant. They need to not be potted plants. Go ahead.
yeah, yeah. So I mean that's it in a nutshell. They need to be engaged. They need to be willing to work and to help, understand and to uh, make the organization successful. That's, it's important that you have that nucleus of people.
Well,
So
and we've got a random Facebook user who did not follow my instructions and go to streamyard.com/Facebook so that I know who they are. But they said they love your words with run it like a real business. It gives them hope that they're on the right track.
great. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, when you go for tax exemption, use Form 1023. Don't use 1023-EZ. 1023-EZ is a fairly new form, and it's a lot shorter, and it's less expensive to file, but it's kind of a sneaky scheme by the IRS. And here's the reason why. The IRS doesn't want to have to review and approve tax-exempt nonprofits to make sure that they are qualified. So the 1023 form, what you do there is you file the form. It's like a 40-page form, but most nonprofits only have to do about 18 pages of that, and it requires the answering of a bunch of questions. It requires submitting your organizational documents, a financial plan, et cetera. And you actually have an IRS reviewer who goes through all of that. And if you qualify, they'll issue a letter that says you qualify. And the nice thing is, because you provide all that information to the IRS, that letter is something you can rely upon. Okay. Contrast that with the 1023-EZ. And in 1023-EZ, you don't submit any of those things to the IRS. What you do is you attest that you qualify. And the logical fallacy with that is that most founders that I know don't know enough about federal tax law to know whether or not they qualify. And so you're making that representation, and back in a fairly obscure document, the IRS says that if you make attestations in that form and any of them turn out to be incorrect, you have no right to rely upon that letter that you receive. That letter is invalid. So, what's the point of getting it if it's going to be invalid, obviously? So I think for that reason, as well as for others, that it's important to use the 1023 as opposed to the 1023-EZ.
Which is kind of awful because, and I ranted about this week, actually, on Wednesday, but it's kind of awful because it's like void is written on your exempt letter in invisible ink.
Yep.
And it's not until the IRS actually has to deal with you, or you submit a 990 and tell them what you've been doing, that you and your donors will learn that that was void. And of course, if that was void, not only do you potentially owe back taxes on the money that you received, but your donors may not have been able to rely on those deductions, and they may be hurt as well.
That's right. That's right. I mean, all of that is true. So it's, if you want to get a letter, and you have to get a letter in order to be tax exempt, and you want to make sure it's a letter that you can rely upon. That's number 3. Number 4, recognize and document conflicts of interest. Okay, so a conflict of interest basically is a transaction involving the nonprofit where a person in authority receives a financial benefit. Okay, so an example that I often give is, on your board, you have the owner of a stationery store, and you want to buy office supplies from that person's store. Well, that's a conflict of interest. Um, Depending on the type of organization you are, if you're a private foundation, that is per se illegal to enter in that type of a transaction. If you're a public charity, which I think most um, organizations want to be at least, uh, basically the IRS requires you to adopt a conflict of interest policy and to go through a protocol to make sure that whatever that transaction is fair to the nonprofit. And what I generally recommend is when a nonprofit wants to adopt a conflict of interest policy, there is an IRS approved form that is an appendix to the instructions for Form 1023. And I recommend that companies adopt that policy verbatim and then go, do what it says. Make sure that if you have a conflict of interest situation, that you follow that policy. And if you do so, and it comes out that it's okay, that it's fair to the nonprofit, then you can go forward with that transaction. And of course, you want to make sure that you document that because that requires a board action. Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5 is register to solicit donations. In most states, in order to solicit donations from the residents, you have to register with the Attorney General or other official in that state. You register, you have to file reports with that, with the Attorney General, and you're subject to their oversight. And a lot of people don't do that. One area of particular concern is where you are soliciting donations through social media. If you have people that are donating in multiple states, technically you're required to register in each of those states if they have a registration requirement. So it's, that's something a lot of people don't do, but it's possible to get into trouble for doing that from a legal standpoint.
So I want to address this because this is one of the most common questions that comes up legally with new nonprofits is charitable registration. And are you aware of any prosecutorial or penalty action that's been taken against a nonprofit that say is in Arizona but didn't register in Wyoming and someone from Wyoming donated? There's a set of principles called, I think, the Charleston Principles or something like that, that were adopted by the National Association of Charity Administrators or whatever they are, back in early 2000s, which basically was like, as long as you're not receiving substantial donations from another state, then you don't have to. But like, has there actually been any serious legal action against nonprofits for failure to register in a state they were not in? Because the burden of registering in, say, 50 states, if you have an email list that reaches all 50 states, it seems insane to me to put that on a small nonprofit that has an email list of 500 people.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not all 50 states. Yeah. For example, Arizona is a state where you don't have to register, but you do have to register in most states. The other thing is, in the statute in most states, there's a de minimis exception. So if you don't have more than a certain amount or number of donations from that state, then you are exempt until you reach that de minimis level. But once you do reach that level, then, as you might imagine, some states are more active than others in making sure that their laws are met, and the laws oftentimes will provide for fines that can be levied. They can prohibit you from receiving donations from residents of their state. They have a number of different remedies that they can seek. And the problem is if you reach that threshold and you're still receiving donations, then you don't have much of a defense. It is what it is. So if you are challenged, then you're going to be looking to try to settle with the attorney general, whoever it is that's bringing that action against you.
Is there a rough amount that's the de minimis? Is it usually like $100? I mean, obviously it depends very much based on the state, but is it like $100, like thousands, 10,000, 50,000? What does it usually tend to be?
A typical would be like 10,000 in
Okay.
total donations.
In a year?
Yeah, in a year. Yeah. So as I say, it depends. It depends on the state. Each one has its own rules, but that's something that you really need to look at as you receive donations from residents of a particular state. Okay.
Awesome. All right.
So that's number 5.
All right, awesome. So, short break before we get on to the next 5. First of all, if you are watching this broadcast and you are enjoying this content, please drop a comment, at least drop a like or a love or a laugh reaction or something on here. The more reactions you drop, the more people in our group who can see this amazing content. So please take a moment. Open the thing up to full screen, drop a like, drop a share, drop something like that in there. That'll be awesome. Second, if you are looking for help creating your nonprofit, getting it started, Next Level Nonprofits, our focus is on new nonprofit leaders and on helping you become a sustainable, impactful nonprofit in your community. And to that end, we do 3 things. Number 1, we help you get your foundations under you. So Mike was talking about your mission, your vision, your mission, your values, your strategy. We help you get set up with a high impact, quick impact project that you can start rolling out and showing you're making a difference in your community so that you can get more donors on board. We help you file with the state and with the federal government for your 501c3 status, and we help you raise your first 50,000. So if you're interested in any of that, book a 30-minute no obligation call with me. We'll chat about your situation at your nonprofit and how we can help you get your nonprofit to make that serious impact in your community. nextlevelnonprofits.us. And of course, if you are enjoying this Launchpad group, please invite other nonprofit leaders, invite your friends. We want this to be the #1 group for nonprofit leaders on Facebook, really on the internet. There's really no place where nonprofit leaders can get such incredible advice like we're getting from Mike Goulding. So please do that. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll go on to number 6.
Number 6, don't commingle nonprofit and personal funds. I mean, that seems like kind of like a no-brainer in a lot of ways. That's the quickest way to get into serious trouble as a nonprofit leader, both from the nonprofit standpoint as well as from the individual's standpoint. If you look at the history of nonprofits over the last 100 years, most of the requirements that have been instituted on all levels, federal, state, local law, have been adopted because of problems with founders, executive directors, others who have misused the nonprofit's funds. So that's, as I say, it really should go without saying, but it's really important to make sure that there's a clear separation between your personal and the nonprofit's funds.
What about startup funding? So before you've actually created the corporation or the entity that you can go get a bank account, how do you make sure that everything is legal and I's are dotted, T's are crossed if you're personally funding the nonprofit startup, but you want to get reimbursed for that?
I would probably have a way, whether it's a separate account or you have really good accounting for the startup expenses, uh, and just keep a good list. And then when you're in a position to be reimbursed for those, then present those to the board and have the board agree to have you be reimbursed for those. It's just
Awesome.
it's a matter of documentation more than anything. Okay, so number 7, um, every action should flow from the mission in some way, directly or indirectly. So when you look at doing anything with a nonprofit, you should be thinking in your mind, how does this promote the mission of the organization? And there should be some nexus between the two in some way. And it's a good idea, in my view, to identify what that is and to document it, because that's again what you're going to be judged upon.
So one question I get a lot in this space is selling stuff under your nonprofit. How do you sell stuff under your nonprofit? Even though the IRS is also very clear it needs to be related to your mission. How do you sell stuff under your nonprofit, like T-shirts and other things like that, to fund the operations without going outside of or being subject to like a business income tax on that?
Yeah, and that's a very important question, because you may very well want to have for example, a web store where you'll sell that type of thing, and that's perfectly legal to do. What I generally suggest to people is that they not become Amazon. So, Amazon has its own way of receiving payment for those items, for all of the aspects of marketing. There are organizations out there that will basically provide a website for you as a subset, essentially, of their website, and they will be very much involved in helping you to decide what you're going to be selling. They will process payments. They will do the shipping of items to the extent that you can, and it's kind of a sliding scale, if you will. It's important to try to push off on somebody else, if you can, some of those details of what Amazon does when you purchase something from them. You don't want to be in the business of selling T-shirts. That's because that is not a charitable activity. Okay, so what you need to be doing is doing what you do as a charity, and have that be part of what you're trying to accomplish, but not being being a store, so to speak.
Question from another anonymous Facebook user. What is a good accounting tool to use? Any suggestions?
Well, yeah, I'm not an expert on accounting tools, to be honest with you. I know that there are a bunch out there, and I think it's just a matter of seeing which one is going to. Again, from a decision making standpoint, do your homework, see what's offered, what's required, and make the best choice that you can.
All right.
Okay. Number 8, insurance. Fiduciaries are personally liable for mistakes, as we talked about. And there are a couple of tools that are used to mitigate that. One is called indemnification. And if you look in your bylaws, typically there will be a very broad indemnification. And what an indemnification is, it basically says that someone else takes responsibility to pay for damages that you're liable for. And in the case of a nonprofit, typically that's the nonprofit corporation. So if you, as a director, become liable and responsible to pay damages, the nonprofit will step up and pay them for you. And indemnification is a very typical kind of provision. The problem with indemnification is that it's only as good as the corporate assets that are available to pay that liability. And in most, particularly startup nonprofits, they have little or no assets. So you got this great indemnification, but there's no way to fund it because the corporation doesn't have any assets to pay it anyway. Okay. So the second level and the more important level is insurance. And there are two types of insurance that every nonprofit should have. One is general liability insurance that protects the nonprofit corporation itself. And probably more important is directors and officers liability insurance, which protects the fiduciaries. The problem is not all policies are created equal. So it's important to actually look at the policy to see what actions are protected, are covered by that particular policy. Oftentimes also you'll find that a D&O rider is attached to another policy that may not even apply to your organization. You know, you may not have any employees, but the D&O policy is attached to a policy that protects you from HR, human resources types of issues, personnel issues. Well, you don't have any. So why are you buying that policy, right? That particular aspect of the policy. So make sure that you're buying what you what you're anticipating. And you want to look at the policy itself and not just at the marketing materials, because the marketing materials will always say, no matter what these say, the policy itself is the contract. And that's what the thing that you need to be concerned about. Okay, so that's insurance. That's very important, a very important thing to have at a very early stage to protect the directors and the executive officers.
Do you have a ballpark?
Number 9 is contract.
Do you have a ballpark cost for particularly D&O? I know liability, general liability really depends on what you're doing, but what should a nonprofit expect to pay per year for directors and officers insurance at the beginning?
You know, that can be really cheap. You know, I've seen policies that are in the $150 a year range. So,
Nice.
I mean, from a financial standpoint, it makes perfect sense to buy a D&O policy. Just as I say, just make sure that it covers what you want it to cover.
Makes sense.
Okay, so number 9 is contracts. Basically, document the organization's business relationships. You know, if you're using the template of another party, for example, a service provider, you want to make sure that you understand what that template provides, because you're going to be liable for that. You're going to be responsible for it. And by doing that, you can determine what your risk tolerance is. You know, sometimes there's really no choice. You know, you want a particular product or service, and in order to get it, you're going to have to sign, you know, the other party's contract. And oftentimes that's something you have to do. But at least know what it is that you're signing so that you understand and decide, make a real decision as to what your risk tolerance is, and then document that decision. For example, with directors and officers, employees, you may have volunteers in your organization. You should be looking at a director agreement, perhaps an employment agreement, you know, with employees and with other parties. If you have, you know, trade secrets, you know, you may want to have a non-disclosure agreement with them. If you have a volunteer group, you may have a volunteer program that you may want to document as well and have agreements in place. As I say, service providers, the entity that's creating your website, for example, you want to make sure that they're doing what they've promised to do. So you need to know what those promises are. So that's remembering that really the purpose of a contract is to avoid mitigation, avoid litigation. Basically by anticipating what could go wrong and then determining in advance how to handle it. That's what a contract does. And so if you make sure that you know what the risks are, and then you decide to accept them, but make a conscious decision to do so. So contracts are very important. And then the last one that I would talk about is number 10. You're a leader, learn how to lead. And most nonprofit services out there will end when the organization has been established, when it's been organized. There's certainly exceptions to that. For example, fundraising, getting grants, and so forth. But most of them kind of stop, and people are kind of left to their own devices as to how to run this organization. It's important to remember that as a fiduciary, again, you're going to be judged by how your decisions are made. And you as a leader are the driver of that process. So it's important to embrace that leadership role, become a student of how to succeed as a leader. And there are a number of ways to do that. There are books out there that you can buy and read. There are leadership coaches that can help, on a very specific basis, to help you to decide how to, basically how to run things. What's the protocol for decision making? What's the communication between the various authority figures in the organization, with the board and with others? How are decisions delegated among the various people in the organization? How is accountability done? Are people accountable for what they're responsible to do? And then how to resolve conflict. That's a very important leadership attribute. And most of us don't have that kind of training. So I think it's important to receive that type of training as to how to be a leader. In my opinion, over time, that's probably the most important element in maintaining a compliant, successful, and sustainable organization. And if you have that leadership, then you're going to be able to handle all of the other aspects of, the legal requirements and responsibilities that are out there.
That is fantastic. Thank you, Mike. That was a great rundown of, including my interruptions, the 10 things that you can do to protect your nonprofit. So, why don't you talk a little bit for a minute or so about how you can help nonprofits as they grow with some of their unique legal challenges that they may run into themselves?
Well, the first part of it is I don't want somebody to worry about money when they first contact me. So I will provide a free consultation on Zoom typically, and where we just sit down and talk about it. I can find out about what you're doing, what your goals are, and then I can help you to understand what your responsibilities are, to point out issues that may come up, things that you can spot and be aware of. Uh, I just think that's a good thing for any nonprofit leader to have, is just that type of a consultation. So that's the first thing that I do. And then the second thing is once we kind of go through that and figure out what the needs are, then if the person wants to go forward with me, then I'm able to help them on the legal issues, whether it's contracts, whether it's tax issues, whatever it is, I can assist with that.
Yes, and as someone who is really skeptical of attorneys, I really like Mike. And that's part of the reason that I brought him onto this call. I've spent 10 years in the nonprofit space. Most of it was in political nonprofits at first. And everybody is either an attorney or thinks they're an attorney that you're talking to. And Mike, I guess the best way I would describe him is humble, which is something that you don't often get in an attorney, but possibly because of your experience with nonprofits. Mike is humble and just a fantastic resource if you have detailed legal questions at all of any kind with your nonprofit as they come up.
Yeah,
really think. Go ahead.
most of the time you don't get that, and you have to understand where I am. I didn't get all period of time. Uh, I've been doing this for a long time, and I do it now because I like it. Because I enjoy, as I say, I enjoy working with people who have and who want to accomplish that mission, and it makes me feel good. Help them to succeed in, and provide the services that they're trying to.
All right. It looks like we lost Mike, unfortunately, right at the very end. Oh, he's back. Go ahead, finish what you were saying, Mike. We lost that entirely. Yeah, go ahead and finish what you were saying there, Mike.
Okay. Um, well, what I'm saying is that I'm doing this because I like it. I'm officially semi-retired, but I do what I do because I enjoy it. I enjoy working with the people who are involved in this type of business, if you will, and it makes me feel good. I mean, I do get paid, obviously, but my rates are a lot less than what you would pay to somebody who has the same amount of experience that I do.
Well, and Mike is my legal beagle. If I have a nonprofit question, I definitely go to him. So I dropped Mike's link in the chat. Mike is also a group expert, which means if you ask a legal question in the group in the future and it's something fairly easy to answer, I'll tag Mike or Mike will see it. He's going to be a member of the Launchpad going forward. So um, thank you so much for being on here, Mike. If you loved what you saw here, invite your friends to the Launchpad so they can see this as well. And of course, leave a love or a like. Next Friday, we have Alicia Mathis. Alicia Mathis is a fantastic expert in program design. So Alicia is going to help you design your program, put your program together, and know what it takes to make a good and effective nonprofit program. She's also a guru of other nonprofit Facebook groups that I probably got you guys from. Super excited to have Alicia Mathis on next Friday. And of course, every Wednesday, I do the Ask Me Anything. And this Ask Me Anything, the first thing we're going to talk about is getting volunteers. How do you get volunteers and how do you manage them effectively? That is really one of my biggest strong suits that I don't currently consult on is bringing in volunteers and getting them managed effectively. So thank you so much for joining us this Friday. You guys have a wonderful weekend and I'll see you guys next week.